In the previous lecture, we arrived at the conclusion that thought is logically, categorically, the opposite nature to action. Thought, in other words, is a logical negation of action. But action always includes thought. We can withdraw into thought, but we cannot withdraw from thought into pure action. So there's an asymmetry. A logical form was derived, a logical framework which states that the positive contains and is constituted by its own negation. Macmurray calls this the form of the personal. Because the idea of an asymmetric polarity is so unfamiliar to us, let us pause to explore it using another common experience. We're all familiar with riding in a car, but it takes a moment of reflection to realize that that smooth ride is only possible because part of the car is always stationary. I'm talking about the point of contact between the tyre and the road. If it weren't stationary, the car would simply slip and wouldn't go anywhere. It is the fact of the grip between the tyre and the road which means the car can move. If you're not convinced of this, consider the movement of a caterpillar track. It becomes much more obvious that while the track is in contact with the ground, it is in fact stationary. And exactly the same happens in the absolutely everyday experience of walking. Again, the ground experiences a series of stationary footprints. Okay, so if we compare intentional action with wheeled locomotion, or walking if you like, we see a very curious similarity. So we know that we've argued that thought is a logical negation of action. We're clear about that. We could also say that stillness is the logical negation of movement. That makes absolute sense to us. They're opposite in quality, opposite in nature. On this side, we say that action necessarily includes and depends on thought. We've argued that. It's also clear to us that movement, in the case of wheeled locomotion, necessarily depends on stillness or resistance to movement. We've just demonstrated that. We can withdraw into pure thought. We know that, yes. A car can be stationary, or we can stop walking. Thought does not include action, but action must include thought. And we can also say on this side of wheeled locomotion that that stillness does not include movement, but movement must include stillness. Otherwise, as we showed, the wheel would simply slip on its point and the whole car wouldn't move. So we see here, in both cases, an asymmetric polarity. So what seemed initially as something very abstract suddenly seems not so extraordinary at all. With that in mind, let us pick up where we left off in the previous lecture. The idea of a donut gave us the way of visually representing an asymmetric polarity. When applied to the relationship between thought and action, it looked like this. So we see that action is a bit like the whole donut. Now there's another curious thing about this. We can withdraw our attention from the whole donut and focus only on the whole. But the whole has no existence of its own. I can't just pick it up and give it to you. Similarly, Similarly, we can withdraw into thought, but thought, like the whole, has no concrete existence, even though it is an essential part of action. There can be no intentional action without thought. So we've arrived at a simple representation of the asymmetric polarity that we call the form of the personal. I now want to explore the distinction between what Macmurray calls fields of experience as opposed to activities of the self. And in doing this, we need to introduce an element of notation. Macmurray distinguishes what he calls fields of experience. For example, the world that we meet through action and experience as other is a field of experience, or the self which is experienced as I. Now, there's a curious paradox here in that the self experiences the world as other, even though we're part of it. So this is another expression of the form of the personal. Now, the fields of experience are represented here spatially. But if that's the case, how are we going to represent what Macmurray calls the activities of the self, namely action and thought? Let us explore this. So here we see the self meeting the world through action. So action here is shown as an arrow or a vector, if you like. It's the self reaching out to meet the world. Now, it is in meeting the resistance of the world, Macmurray would say, that we gain primary knowledge of it. We know that it is there. But at the same time, action is only possible because there is thought. Now, thought is the representation, it's the discrimination of that which we met through action. Whereas in action we modify the world, in thought we modify our ideas about the world. It's an inward movement and it's opposite in nature, and it's here represented as an arrow again, but this time pointing inwards. So the logic of this diagram is that the positive arrow reaching out into the outer part of the donut, if you like, includes its own negation, in this case thought, reaching inwards. We can, of course, withdraw into thought, in which case only the inward vector of thought, the negative vector, is active. And we can return to full engagement with the world, in which case both action and thought are active. So we see here the distinction between fields of experience represented spatially and what Macmurray calls activities of the self, in this case action and thought, represented linearly by vectors. Interestingly, although Macmurray acknowledges the existence of fields of experience, almost all his logical reasoning is focused on the logical relation between activities of the self. As this is unfamiliar, let us look at it again with slightly different descriptors. We have other. That's the word that Macmurray tends to use for the world that we meet in action. In contrast to that, we have I, which is the self. So Macmurray often uses pronouns to refer to elements of experience. So in action, I meets the other. As before, we meet the resistance of the other and so have our existence affirmed too. This is the positive action, but this is possible only because we also have the inward movement of thought, negation of that. And we can, again, withdraw into thought. And this could be because our action has failed and we need to rethink it and think of a new strategy. Or it could be that we've just completed a phase of action and we want to replay it in our mind in order to celebrate it and enjoy it. And then, of course, we can return to full engagement in action, to return to our action or to start a new phase of action. We have so far then made the first tentative steps towards a simple notation for the form of the personal. I want to argue that in developing any logical framework, notation is both natural and essential. Let's briefly consider mathematics. We're all familiar with equations like this, but what many of us don't know is before the 16th century, all equations were written out in words. It was called rhetoric notation. Now, that was okay for relatively simple equations, but when it came to more complicated things, it became completely unmanageable. But it's not only symbolic notations that's important in the development of mathematics. There are a whole range of visual notation has developed, not least of all Cartesian coordinates. But in the fields of logic, we also find notation. Here's Boolean algebra or Venn diagrams. Also in systems thinking, diagrams are used for mapping complex relationships. We could also consider the way that science makes use of visual representation, for example, understanding the atom in its various forms. No one's saying this is what an atom actually looks like, but it provides a very concise visual representation to help us understand it. If you're not naturally a visual person, I hope you'll bear with me as we dive down into the layers of complexity. What exactly do I mean by this term, layers of complexity? Let us explore the number system. Whole numbers are fine if we want to simply count sheep, but if we want to measure height accurately, we might need fractions. If we want depth, we might need negative numbers as well. But it doesn't stop there. If we explore circles, we might discover irrational numbers like pi. And then we find the need for complex numbers and so on. So we see there's a whole set of layers of complexity in our exploration of the logic of numbers. And we find the same layers of complexity when exploring Macmurray's understanding of the form of the personal. In this first lecture series, then, we explore the form of the personal as expressed in Macmurray's self as agent. And in doing so, we discover 4 levels of complexity. We've just touched on the donut model already. Now, in the second lecture series, we apply all these logical principles to persons in relation, and that's where it gets really interesting. Now, some people may prefer to explore just the first 2 or 3 levels and then move on to lecture series 2 to explore persons in relation. And I would recommend that for anybody who's not so familiar with Macmurray, as it gives an overview. Level 4 becomes quite complex and requires a certain amount of intellectual resilience.